So I want to comment a little bit about this diplomatic standoff between Canada and China regarding the case of Meng Wanzhou, who's a leading executive of the telecoms giant Huawei, which is China's largest mobile phone network, or not network, I should say, maker. Um, there is a lot of talking points to be made around this one. I'll try not to make the video too long. Just a disclaimer before I begin. If any of my Chinese friends come across this video, all I can say is you may you may not like some of the things I have to say. It doesn't change my hopefully it won't change our friendship, but this is how I feel about this situation, and I have to be honest about it because I feel strongly about this sort of subject as I do about my friendship. So that's the reality. To others who may think that's a strange thing to say, it's because I kind of find myself between a rock and a hard place on these situations. Um, my sentiments, let me just say from the outset, my sympathies are entirely with the Canadian side, and I'm going to explain why. But um, it's not a comfortable position to be in when you know that as a Westerner you have to keep it quiet in China. It's not comfortable. But so long as I have access to this, I'm not going to be silent. So, what's the background here? Meng Wanzhou is a leading executive, like I say, on Huawei, and she has been arrested in Vancouver on a US warrant on a charge of um, violating American led sanctions against Iran um, by being dishonest about her transactions with banks and therefore putting them at risk of violating the sanctions. Now, that's a charge. I'm not going to say she's guilty. I don't know. I just don't know. She might be innocent. It might be a case of an honest mistake, or I don't know. But it's a serious charge. Violating sanctions is a serious charge. So what's the current situation? As I understand it, she has been released on bail. She has two homes in Vancouver. She is free to be free in Vancouver to to walk around. She has absolute freedom within the city of Vancouver. Two luxury homes as well, I understand. Now, this is where things get interesting. The Chinese have responded by arresting on the charges of espionage three Canadian nationals in China, in Beijing. One of them is a businessman, another is a teacher, and the third is a diplomat by the name of Michael Kovrig. Now, so far, the only clear information available is on Michael Kovrig. The Chinese authorities are being deliberately vague and elusive about the fate of the other two. So he's been charged with espionage, which to me seems like very interesting timing. Spying is a very serious charge against any country. So why now? Why were these Canadians not arrested before? It's very obvious to me that the only reason Beijing is doing this is for revenge, for a petty sense of revenge. Um, and because the Chinese legal system is extremely corrupt, they are not going, that's why we see a lack of transparency here. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying was asked about this. I don't know who by, because it's not like Western journalists can just get up and ask questions. But maybe she just brought it up as a way of deflecting Western criticism. She basically said that she didn't know where you heard the reports about the bad treatment, but they're being treated humanely and inquiries should be made to the local authorities. So she was just wiping her hands of it, basically. Now, what is known about Michael Kovrig's case is that he doesn't appear to have suffered any physical abuse, but he has been denied access to a lawyer. Now, that is a basic human right. He's been denied access to a lawyer. He has had to sleep in a room where the light has been on all night. Now, that's basically, a sort of attempt at so-called soft torture because it's sleep deprivation. Um, and he has been denied access to his family as well. Now, this is just typical of the callousness of the communist regime. Um, and it really doesn't surprise me. But this is the thing I want to touch on. I'm not going to talk about guilt and innocence on either side. I'm not going to say that Meng Wanzhou is definitely guilty, and I'm not going to say that the Canadians are definitely innocent. I don't know either way. What I want to talk about is the contrast between the two systems. That's a very important issue because, not surprisingly, as always happens, when there's some big fallout between China and the West, the internet gets flooded. These sort of stories, if you go to YouTube, you'll see it, get flooded with pro-Beijing comments and comments like, "Oh, look at the Canadians, they're hypocrites. They preach human rights, but look at the terrible way Meng Wanzhou has been treated." No, she's on bail. She can continue living in her luxury homes until her trial, her day in court. Contrast that to these three young Canadians who no doubt are very frightened, under a lot of stress, and being denied the most basic legal due process. Now, of course, the Chinese are not going to torture them. They're not going to leave any marks. That would be too obvious. But this is a nasty, vicious, dishonest regime, and I wouldn't put it past them to try and get some sort of charge, trumped up charge on these Canadian nationals purely out of revenge. Um, and it's a scary situation for any Westerner in China because any of us could be targeted. I'm no one important, but they could arrest me if my country fell out with China and say, "Oh, this British teacher's a spy," which I'm not, incidentally. But they don't care about due process. They don't care about evidence. It's just a nasty totalitarian regime that crushes all dissent. That is the way the Chinese Communist Party works, and it's a way they have been working for 70 years, 69 years. So let's look at the two systems. Canada. You have a very clear system of due process where people have legal representation, where they have their day in court. You have an open media, a free media that is independent of the government, that is often critical of government, and where there is rigorous political debate. Canada's human rights record is not perfect. I'm not going to say that it is. The record, for example, on Indigenous people is far from something to shout about. Even until quite recently, into the 20th century, it was pretty bad. So I'm not going to say that Canada has a perfect human rights record, and most Canadians wouldn't claim that either. But it is sure as hell a lot better than China, which is not difficult. China, one party, has absolute control on everything. No other opinions are allowed. A legal process, a legal system that is very corrupt. Now, I know that Xi Jinping is trying to fight corruption, but he's also doing it from the vantage point of absolute power. So we are seeing the rise, possibly, of a second Mao, which should definitely raise alarm bells. But a legal system where there are actually lawyers in the Chinese legal system, believe it or not, and in the Chinese constitution, believe it or not, people have a right to a lawyer. But very often, you know, because the party has absolute power, it's there. They basically make it up as they go along. With cases like this, cases involving foreigners, they will twist it any way they can to try and hammer these young Canadians. And you have a media that is entirely controlled by the Communist Party. There's zero free media. Now, you have another factor in all of this, which is very, very important, and that is the Chinese education system. Now, I've seen it firsthand. Young Chinese are indoctrinated from a very young age to love the country. Nationalism is very, very intense here. It's very rigidly, brought into people's thinking. And I want to be clear here, I'm not generalizing anyone. I'm not for a second saying that all Chinese are hysterical, flag waving nationalists. No, not at all. I've known many, particularly young people, who are very reasonable and open minded, and they are well aware that there are problems. But by the same token, whenever something like this happens, you can be damn sure that the Communist Party is going to stoke up nationalistic tensions in the Chinese diaspora. Now, Canada has a large Chinese minority population, and they vary. There are, generations of Chinese Canadians, particularly in Vancouver. But there are also Chinese. i.e., mainland Chinese citizens living there, like Meng Wanzhou. And what we are seeing is the contradiction of two systems: a system that allows dissent and a system that doesn't. Because in Canada, supporters of Meng Wanzhou can freely protest. They can say how innocent she is, how terrible all is. Now, some of those people are going to be big fans of Huawei, and I think that might be the motivating factor. But there will also be others, Chinese nationals in particular, who have been stoked up by the Chinese government. Now, I'm not saying that Communist Party officials are on the streets and telling them where to go and so on, but this is the byproduct of years of nationalistic indoctrination, and you could be damn sure that the Chinese regime is stoking up those sentiments. So we see that. It's very obvious. It's been going on for years, most recently in Britain with the Hong Kong Ling Nin situation, which I have spoken to someone directly involved in that case. And what you had there was so-called journalists, and I say so-called because many Chinese journalists are little more than cheerleaders for the party, getting up, rudely interrupting a speaker at a forum that was discussing the situation in Hong Kong. She rudely interrupted. She got into a nationalistic rant in another country, by the way, and then she got arrested because she was charged with assaulting a young volunteer. Now, again, you saw a situation where the Chinese embassy was demanding an apology, and CGTN, which is a Communist Party mouthpiece, was also demanding an apology. And this is the track record. They love to demand apologies, and yet they never show humility in other countries. What I find galling is the incredible arrogance and hypocrisy of Beijing, because I think this comes from history. We all know about the century of humiliation. China's just still busy getting the revenge. They have never got over that. They would like to think they have, but they haven't. They're still very bitter about it. So every single opportunity they have, they try to get this sort of petty revenge. Like, oh look, we're taking the Canadian spies. China's showing strength. No, actually, it's showing bullying behavior. Um, I mean, it's not just a street protest. You see online people coming out with things like, "This is what happens when you mess with China." Like, don't mess with the dragon. These sort of things. It's a bully's mentality because basically the mindset is because there's so many of us, we can do what we want. I would make this point to Chinese Canadians. If you genuinely believe that she's innocent, of course it's your right to protest. But I hope that you will have the integrity and the honesty to challenge Chinese mainland nationalists who try to make a comparison between Canada and the West. You are protesting. You're protesting. That is impossible in China. It's basically, it just isn't allowed. It's not allowed for Chinese. It definitely isn't allowed for foreigners. So how anyone could try and make a comparison between the two systems is perverse. And I think that needs to be robustly challenged. Anyone who really thinks, and I have been doing that, I've been engaging in, I've been responding to these nonsense comments because I think they need to be challenged. To say that there is any sort of comparison, and these Chinese nationalists are lining up to say, oh, look at hypocritical Canada talking about human rights, but look at how they treat our citizen. Yeah, she's been given due process and she's allowed to stay in her luxury homes. How awful. If she's innocent, she will be cleared. Um, I really, really think it is time that Western countries in general see what is going on here. And I'm talking about the fact that the Chinese government stokes up these sort of nationalistic tensions. To Chinese citizens in the West, I'm not going to generalize. I mean, for example, Chinese Canadians, Chinese Britons, most of them are no fans of the Communist Party. But sometimes I think they have a sort of ethnic bias. There's a kind of, and that's going to be a controversial thing to say, but I think solely because she is a Chinese woman, they're kind of getting, oh, it must be racist, it must be, um, and to be clear here, I'm not talking about everyone. I'm definitely not talking about everyone, but the fact of the matter is she is a senior member, she's a senior executive in China's largest phone company, so she is definitely going to have close ties to the party because in China it's impossible to get to that level without having ties to the party. Impossible. And that's the sad reality of aspiration in China. The only way you could go far in this country is by being close to the party. It's the only way. So every major Chinese business person, every major Chinese entrepreneur, every every successful Chinese basically has to have ties to the Communist Party. That's the sad reality. Um, so I really think the West needs to get assertive. We need to really insist that if people come to Western countries to study for business, um, for any other reason, they need to respect Western sovereignty. And I'm sick and tired of Western tolerance being taken for granted by Chinese nationals because that is what we are seeing. And then they play the victim. There's no comparison. If you're a Chinese living in the West, you have far more rights than a Westerner has in China. That's not to say that Westerners are treated badly in China. I mean, personally, I've had a very hospitable welcome, and I don't want to be misunderstood. My colleagues, students, people have been very friendly, and I don't want that to be misunderstood. But I'm talking about rights. I'm talking about, for example, the right to protest. So if I see, for the sake of argument, a major person on CCTV or CGTN as it now is, making some sort of xenophobic rant against foreigners, can I defend myself? Can I protest outside the CGTN headquarters? No, impossible. Impossible. So that's what pisses me off. There is blatant hypocrisy on the part of Beijing, and for them to have the audacity to talk about human rights is beyond pathetic. And they know what they're doing. Beijing is many things, but it's not stupid. It knows how to manipulate. It knows how to have this so-called soft nationalism, this sort of it's a soft power technique, except I would argue it isn't very soft power. It's actually pretty aggressive. It's incredibly arrogant. It's incredibly disrespectful. I'm sick and tired of Beijing demanding apologies and demanding respect, but never showing any. And it is high time that Western governments say, look, we're going to welcome you as students, as business people, as tourists. But don't come to Western countries and think that you could just fly around the Chinese flag and do whatever you want. Just because we have the right to protest doesn't mean it's okay for you to disrespect the host nation by doing that. And I do think maybe it's high time. For example, in Britain, the Canadians can think for themselves. But I will say one thing, though, here. Canada's a sister nation. Canadian values are British values. So I think that when you have a situation where it's a standoff between China and a democracy, in almost every circumstance, I am going to back up the democracy because there is simply no comparison between the situation. I'm not saying she is guilty. I hope she gets a fair trial, and I'm sure she will. What I hope doesn't happen is that the Canadian authorities bow to Chinese pressure and they allow themselves to be bullied, as the British authorities were in the Kong Ling Ling case. It's not that we apologise, we didn't, but I really, really don't think that there should be a situation of Western countries going out of the way to not offend the Chinese, because the Chinese Communist Party are incredibly sensitive people. They're actually very weak in that sense. They're powerful in the sense of holding political power, but they're very weak in terms of their own personal ego. Those Politburo members, they are super, super sensitive people. They have very thin skin, they're very weak people in that sense. And I really think that we need to start fighting back. I am sick and tired of this. And as someone who has been to both sides, I've been in China twice now. I feel I know this country fairly well. And I know how the communist regime operates. And it is high time that hell, I could be taking a real risk talking so openly here. But there's no cameras in my room, so I'm safe. I tell you something though, if I was in a top hotel, I wouldn't be saying this. In the hotel I stayed in Shanghai, they had like a visitor book about rules and codes of conduct and so on. Now they had every normal things like no smoking and no prostitution. Okay, you expect those things, but no wrong political thought was one of the points that they made in this guest book. So that really tells you all about Chinese tolerance. Um, it's intolerant. It's an intolerant country when it comes to differing points of view. Um, and with all due respect to my Chinese friends, you can't. There's ample evidence for this. I've personally experienced it, so I know what I'm talking about. And that's it. I'll leave it there, but I really, really think Western countries need to get more assertive. Meng Wanzhou is going to have her day in court. I think the pressure should continue from not just Canada, but every friend of Canada needs to be stepping up, putting pressure on the Chinese embassy to show some more transparency, to provide evidence that these Canadian citizens are spies. So far, they have zero evidence. Zero evidence. So the Trudeau administration needs to be absolutely hammering away at the Chinese embassy here. And yes, it will lead to tension, but these three young Canadians don't know what's going to happen to them. They could be looking at years in a Chinese jail. So it's just a callous attempt at revenge by the Chinese side. Because if they were really spies, if they really had suspicion that these people were spies, why were they not arrested before? Why is it only happening now after this case? Simple. They want revenge. And it's pathetic.